Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Director's Lecture Series program with the Honorable Kay Bailey Hutchison. While I wish that we were able to convene in person at Baker Hall at Rice University, we are glad that we can hold this important event with you virtually. Ambassador Hutchison is a longtime friend of the Institute. I remember fondly she was actually present at our ribbon cutting dedication of Baker Hall in October 1997, while a United States Senator from Texas. Since 2017, Ambassador Hutchison has served as the U.S. Ambassador to Nato, a position which is key to the conduct of American foreign policy. We are obviously in a time of immense uncertainty. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a game-changing challenge, not only domestically, but also in terms of geopolitics. And we're bolstered this morning from the good news that Pfizer may have indeed a vaccine that can be produced in the not too distant future. But in the midst of all this, armed conflicts and other threats to the international security still abound. As Ambassador Hutchison, I believe, will note, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has been an essential guarantor of transatlantic stability for the past 70 years. It's no overstatement to say that it is the United States and the world's most significant alliance. In addition to being the permanent representative of the US to NATO, Ambassador Hutchison has a storied career in public service and law. She served as a U.S. Senator from Texas from 1993 to 2013, before which she was the Texas State Treasurer. She was also a member of the Texas House of Representatives from 1973 to 1976 and practiced law at Bracewell LLP up until her current government role. So please join me in warmly welcoming Ambassador Hutchison.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. First of all, I'm so pleased to be with the Baker Institute and with you. My goodness, you have done an incredible job at building this institution that is so important for our state, that we have the kind of foreign policy studies that you do, and the papers and the opinions, and just bringing so many foreign policy experts and leaders into Houston. And I think it's so important for Texans to really see all of the things that are happening worldwide, because of course we are a global state and our companies do global business. And so you've really brought that in. And of course, I'm a huge fan forever and ever of Jimmy Baker and all he has done for our country. And he's made Texas so proud, not to mention the great book that has just come out about him, and talking about the wise man of Washington. And oh my gosh, I can really relate so much more since I've been at NATO to some of the things that he was facing that you have faced, because you too were an ambassador, especially in the Middle East. And what's just happened in the last couple of months in the Middle East, I know is something that you have worked long and hard for. So it's great to be with you. Let me just start by saying that NATO is, of course, as a United States Senator for 20 years, I have been such a strong supporter of NATO. And I'll just start back when I was in the Senate. We were then debating about the open door, whether we really wanted to increase the numbers in NATO. We started with 12. It had built through the years somewhat, but then when the Soviet Union broke up and the former Soviet republics now started wanting to get into NATO as well as into the EU, we had a big debate in the Senate about whether we did want to expand that much. And of course, the smaller group was easier to manage. It was more common in our interests and backgrounds. But we did choose to open the door to NATO. And I am so glad we did, because I now see how much stronger these countries are, the newer members, the former Soviet republics that have had to do the reforms in order to be eligible for the EU or for NATO. And that those reforms have made them stronger to be able to protect themselves as well as be allies that could be part of our NATO alliance. So we've gone from 12, and just with our most recent addition of North Macedonia, we are now at 30 allies. And I would say that it is such an important, now strong alliance that when we look to the future, I think we have even bigger dreams of NATO's role as we are assessing the threats that face all of our countries. So we are the Transatlantic Security Alliance. Of course, the US and Canada in our hemisphere, but then the European members that we work together for our common security. And I was asked recently to do a paper on the security threats of our country over the next year. And I said, well, the next year is just a drop in the bucket. If we're going to look at the security of our country for the next year, we're looking at having to prepare for a much longer period, because the threats that we're facing are much stronger, much more diverse, and much longer term. And if there is one thing that NATO does, and with American leadership, I must say, it's to assess our threats on a strategic level and then begin to deter against those threats so that we will never have another war. And that was the reason that NATO was formed. It was formed after World War II so that America wouldn't come in late in a war that was already going and was already so devastating. So NATO is to deter. So if you then start looking at those long-term threats, you have to say that today our threats are basically the malign influence of Russia and terrorism. Now, I'll take terrorism first, because our real missions right now are the counterterrorism missions. We're in Afghanistan because it's the only time that NATO has invoked our Article 5. That article says if one of us is attacked, we're all attacked. And America was attacked on 9/11, and NATO agreed to go into Article 5 to say all of us are attacked. And that is why we are in Afghanistan together today in our NATO mission, along with our US mission, of course, is to keep terrorism from growing in Afghanistan, where it can be exported to Europe or to North America. Well, we are certainly still in Afghanistan. As you know, we are very much part of the mission. The US has a separate counterterrorism mission, but also with NATO as our alliance to try to train and advise the Afghan troops so that they will be able to hold down terrorism and bring peace to their country. Right now, as I'm sure all of your group that are watching now know, the US is working with an intra-Afghan dialogue that is the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan sitting at the table to try to hammer out a coexistence, a peace that could be lasting in Afghanistan. So we are certainly supportive of that, and we are hoping that there can be results which have not really come to any kind of productive end yet, but we are hoping for that. We're also in counterterrorism in Iraq. Most certainly, we went in to try to stop the rise of ISIS in Iraq, and there is much Iranian activity in Iraq that is trying to destabilize Iraq as well. And we are standing with the new government of Iraq, also NATO and the US, to try to keep terrorism and keep ISIS from regrowing in Iraq and destabilizing Iraq and strengthening Iran's position in the region. So that's the terrorism side. Moving to Russia, Russia is most certainly one of the adversaries that is really, it's building up a lot of defenses that we must recognize and build up our defense against those missiles that they are building, and that we are in the process of doing that right now. The US, because of the violations of Russia in the INF Treaty, we saw that they were building missiles in violation of the treaty, which are sort of intermediate range missiles. And now we are in the process of withdrawing from the treaty, which we have maintained all through the time that we have seen Russia violating. And we are building now defenses against the missiles, but we are not yet finished with that operation. So Russia, in addition to building up missiles, has attacked just about every one of the allies in hybrid attacks, social media that is malign, that is saying things that are not true, trying to breed discontent in our democracies. And we are trying to deter against the malign activity of Russia by building up our defenses on hybrid and cyber warfare at the same time as we are building up against the Russian buildup of missiles. Now, the United States, in their recent strategic review of our risks and threats, has now determined that it is the big power competition with China as well as Russia that is what we must build up our capabilities to resist in the future. And China has been very strategic in what they have been doing that we really have not recognized in any major way until the last 2 years. And the US leadership is working through our NATO alliance to look at what China is doing. The Belt and Road Initiative that is building up infrastructure on the ports throughout Europe, as well as the Arctic, all the way over into seeing activity of Russian submarines that are coming across the Arctic and into even our side of the Atlantic. So we're now looking at the things that China is doing and building up their infrastructure, as well as Russia, and looking at that big power competition to determine how can we build up our defenses to stop anything that might be done. So in addition to looking at the threats that we're facing from Russia and China, we're also looking at a diversity of the kinds of warfare that are coming into being. It's not just missiles anymore. It's also hybrid and cyber, sowing discontent to destabilize governments, to withdraw down the trust of people in their institutions, in in our democracies. And it's also like you look at what we're facing right now with COVID-19. Now we're looking at something that all of us are facing, and all of our economies are suffering because of the lockdowns. And you look at that and you think, now, if that could be done in this healthcare field, and what could you do with that as a weapon? What could you do with a virus as a weapon, or something that would go into the water or the air? And so we're having to now begin to look at that kind of potential weaponry from something that we have just seen out of the blue almost in this last year, all through the world. And then you also look at space as a new domain. We now see buildups in space of potential artificial intelligence, use of space as a potential area of warfare through guiding missiles, through building up arsenals in space. So while the US has also declared space as a domain, so has NATO. And we are beginning to assess what we can do for deterrence capabilities with our allies in space. So there is so much now that's new, both in the types of threats that we face, the kinds of big missile type regular warfare that we've seen in the past, but the new kinds of potential threats that we could face that we really have just in this last couple of years begun to assess, and then begin to look for ways that we could deter. Let me just say one other thing, and then I'll open it for questions, of course. As we are looking at these new big threats, I think you're going to see a movement in NATO now to begin to be the place where partners coalesce for the strength of like-minded nations, nations that have respect for human rights and protect human rights, rule of law, nations that have democracies or have rights of the people protected. We are looking now to start trying to bring together the like-minded countries for the capability to have the strongest deterrence against adversaries who don't have other allies, who don't respect human rights, who don't have a rule of law, who certainly don't have democracies. And we know that our adversaries, not terrorists, not Russia, not China, are there those kinds of protections. And if those are going to be our adversaries of the future, then we must have what we now call NATO 2030. And that is the beginning of the outreach to more partners that create a stronger bond for our way of life, our Western civilization, that we would be ready to make sure we hold and we protect. And today, NATO has 39 partners along with 30 allies. So we have begun that buildup. And let me just mention one other area that I think is going to be important for our hemisphere, and that is we are beginning a dialogue now in Latin America. We have one Latin American partner, Colombia, and we have a great relationship with Colombia. And I have started in this last year, actually a whole year because it started last fall, bringing together the Latin American ambassadors that are in Brussels to say, you know, we would like to just have a dialogue and at NATO, talk about what you see as your threats. Where do you see the need for talking about security. And almost unanimously, there were about 15 of them, they said it's hybrid and cyber warfare. It is the malign social media that is trying to destabilize our governments, that come in and criticize our governments, criticize our parliaments, criticize our leaders, and begin to chip away at the stability of the governments. So we are opening that dialogue with Latin America. And, you know, you ask the question, well, what kind of malign influence is in there? And they'll say China, well, they'll say Cuba, but also China, Russia, and Hezbollah in Latin America. But that's what they say. They are seeing that Iranian influence that is coming into Latin America as well. So, you know, our adversaries are sophisticated. They know how to try to destabilize without any weapon systems. And those are the kinds of things that we've got to be ready to give our positions and strengthen our democracies, our Western countries that want to have the human rights, the rule of law, and the protection of our citizens in the same way. So I really appreciate so much the opportunity to talk to all of you and just lay out a few of the things that we're seeing from NATO. And I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have, Ed, or your audience.
Thank you very much for that excellent overview of NATO. You've answered my first question brilliantly in terms of what are the most important responsibilities for NATO right now beyond Europe. And I'm impressed with the scope of the substantive challenges. You mentioned cybersecurity, terrorism, COVID. And so I infer from your remarks that the NATO alliance is seized with these issues and that in your inner deliberations, you are taking on these issues. Is that correct?
Yes. Our head of state meeting in London last year did open the door on beginning to look at China, and with the buildup of the Belt and Road Initiative, the buildup of the islands in the South China Sea, the use that China is making of really predatory lending. They're taking over infrastructure sometimes where they have gone into a country that is not able to repay debts, and they're taking the infrastructure as the payment. So they're building up a lot through predatory lending and economic pressure. So we presented this in the head of state meeting, and they did adopt now our NATO effort to begin to assess what China is doing and make sure that we are reaching out to our Asia Pacific partners as well to start building up knowledge, and that then would follow with ways to be able to deter. What China did with India in June, where in the border between China and India, the Chinese soldiers attacked the Indians, and it was quite a brutal battle. And so I think India is opening their eyes now to how they can build up partnerships to be stronger in the region. So yes, we are with all of the heads of state in unison saying, yes, we need to start looking into this area. NATO is now working with our military committee and our military advice to branch out and look at all of the activities and then begin to address how we can build coalitions to address those risks.
You know, listening to your comments, Ambassador, I'm really struck by, there's so much discourse about the threat, some opportunities, but the threat of an emerging global power called China. And yet, in listening to you, the NATO alliance, which is so unique and so powerful, there's no countervailing alliance that the Chinese have, or bodies of alliances that really can even compare to NATO. So it's an important factor. NATO. I'm very pleased to hear that NATO has really expanded its agendas way beyond Europe and is looking at many of the conflict situations in the world and the emerging threats that you mentioned. Uh, in terms of the outreach of NATO, there's one conflict that I'm very interested in for obvious reasons, but the ongoing fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's one of these horrible frozen conflicts that blow up in our collective faces at the most inopportune times and then risk a larger conflagration. In this case, in the South Caucasus, but can bring in Turkey, Russia, Iran, ourselves, NATO. But does NATO have any purview on such a conflict? I know how complicated it is, but does NATO play a role? I know that the OSCE Minsk group is involved, but does NATO have can NATO be of help?
Well, we are most certainly trying to use our influence in the region to try to call for a ceasefire. Now, that has not been really very successful, to be honest. The US has tried it. Russia has tried it. There are different groups now trying to say, stop the conflict, stop the killing, because hundreds have died in this conflict already. And as you said, it's a 30-year sort of detente that has now broken out. And as you know, one of our allies, Turkey, has taken the side of Azerbaijan, but Armenia and Azerbaijan are both partners of NATO. So NATO itself has stayed very neutral and wanting the ceasefire to be achieved. And we have bilaterally made the effort to do this. Secretary Pompeo met with the foreign ministers of both Armenia and Azerbaijan. They agreed on a ceasefire and it lasted about a weekend. The Russians did the same thing. It lasted about a weekend. And what we're doing now is urging both Azerbaijan and Armenia to go to the co-chairs of the Minsk group, which is Russia, US, and France, to settle the conflict itself, not the war part, but the border part, the sovereignty part. And it is, as you said, a very complicated issue because the border of Azerbaijan goes all around the Nagorno-Karabakh area, but the citizens are largely, almost exclusively Armenian. And so it's a very tough and tense situation that had sort of just been simmering, but not with armed conflict until just recently. So are we taking a formal role? No, but we are doing everything that we can to try to say, stop the war, go to the Minsk group, and the three, Russia, US, and France together could be the arbiter. And both have agreed to do that, but it's very tense, and we're just hoping, of course, and urging and trying to make everyone see that armed conflict is not going to settle the issue, and we need to settle it once and for all by settling the borders and what are the rights of the people who live in that region. And it's very very tense, as you said.
Well, I agree that, especially in that conflict, they have to move from conflict management to conflict resolution, and I hope that the efforts will succeed. One of the major issues that, and it's not only the Trump administration, but before, was burden sharing in NATO. Can you give us your assessment of how that issue has evolved?
Well, I can tell you that 20 years in the Senate, every president with whom I served made the same observation to the Europeans that they need to do more. And I will tell you, my allies, the other ambassadors tell me all the time that they know they need to do more. The good news is they are stepping up. They are now submitting their plans for the capabilities that we are asking them to do. And that is to spend the 2%. And the 10 of the allies are now spending 2%. But we know that we've got to do more, because if we are going to face a real foe like China of the future, which we hope will not be a real adversary, but we have to deter in order to achieve that. We've got to have the capabilities. We've got to have the airplanes. We've got to have the ships. We've got to have the submarines. We've got to have the space control. And all of these things are costly. And we can't do it alone in the United States. And the Europeans realize that, and they are much stronger now. In the last 5 years, they've increased 130 billion in achieving increases in their spending. And if we go forward to say 2024, which is when everyone agreed in 2014 that they would try to achieve, or they would go to the goal of 2% by 2024. By 2024, just the plans that have been submitted already will take us 400 billion of increase. So it is a vast increase. Everyone's going in the right direction. Everyone is increasing their spending, but we are continuing to stress how important this is, and to really show people, and especially in this time of COVID, when all of our economies are down, all of us are certainly strapped for funds because of our economies being down. We can't let up, though. And that is the unified message that we have. We've got to continue to do the spending and do the capability building, because we can't let COVID turn from a health crisis into a security crisis. And it will be a security crisis if we let down on that trajectory that we are on to increase our capabilities and make sure that we have the ability to deter a very strong potential adversary, and most certainly the costs of all the new kinds of warfare that we might face.
Along those lines, we have a question from a mutual friend of ours, Chase Untermeyer. He wants to know, to what extent has pressure from the current administration led to increases in defense spending by NATO's allies?
Well, as I said, every president that I have worked with has said Europe needs to do more. Right. But I think the president's very tough stance on this has produced results. I think that he has asked our European allies to do more. And I think they are stepping up, because they see that really it is in their interest to do it. The president has been very strong and very tough on it, but I think that has resonated, and it is producing results.
Much has been written about the need for structural reforms within NATO. And if if structural reforms are needed in your view, which of these reforms do you consider to be most crucial?
Well, I think the biggest issue in structural reforms is the need to keep our unity. And right now, NATO has a consensus rule, which means we have to have unanimous consent on anything we do, whether it's taking in a new partner, whether it is building up a certain area of defense, whether it is declaring a new space domain, whether it is saying we have a potential adversary in China. So we now have a real problem if one country takes a bilateral dispute into NATO and blocks something that affects that bilateral dispute. We have been able, through the 70 years of NATO, to keep that from happening. It has taken a lot of negotiation, a lot of give and take, which our allies have done. But as we have increased, going from 12 to 30, there are more and more differences, more and more bilateral disagreements. And if we have anything to really address, to keep our alliance strong, and the unity is the strength, we've got to be able to have ways that an ally can say, I disagree, but I'm not going to hold up the progress. And that's what we've got to figure out here, and try to make sure that we keep that unity, keep that strength, while letting people have the pressure release valve that allows them to say, no, we don't agree with that. We have a different view of your enemy or your issue, but yet if 29 are of the opinion that we need to move, we shouldn't have one person or one country holding up because of something that isn't related to the issue at hand. So if I had one thing that I would say in my swan song, it will be, we've got to keep the unity that is our strength. If we have an alliance that is not unified, then it will not be able to act boldly. And the boldness has allowed the adaptation of new concepts, new assessments, new capability targets, and we've got to be able to keep that strength and that unity and protect it. And that will be what I will say to my wonderful colleagues. And I got to tell you, I think the NATO ambassadors here that I work with every day are fabulous. They really, really are. And it's been such a joy to work with them and to see their sense of history and their sense of totally supporting the transatlantic bond. They know that America is the leader that holds the glue in this alliance. And that creates such a strong bond for our transatlantic security. And we've got to keep that strength and that bond that can't break down over a bilateral issue.
Along those lines of the unity of the alliance, how do you see the future of the transatlantic relationship? You've been intimately involved in this.
You know, I will say that I think the transatlantic nature of the alliance is essential. And I came, well, you know, in my 20 years in the Senate, I was such a pro-defense senator that I knew NATO was important, and I knew that the alliance was the significant security alliance in the history of the world, actually. But what I did not really realize was the strength that the transatlantic bond brought. And I would say that we clearly bring the strongest commitment to defense, and nobody would argue with that. We spend up almost 4% of our gross domestic product, and it's it's Republicans and Democrats. It's bicameral. It's bilateral. But it is important for Democrats and Republicans that we spend so much on defense. But that's not the glue that holds this alliance together. It's the difference between the way America looks at defense and the importance of defense to us without any difference between Republicans and Democrats, and the way the Europeans look at it. And America, besides spending the most money, America is the country that will call out a potential adversary. Mm-hmm. And we're the ones that have to push. We have the will to declare an adversary. You have to push the Europeans to do that. And that's what we do. And the Europeans will tell me, we want you to push us. We know that we are reluctant to call out an adversary. And the Europeans tend to put economic issues first. Americans tend to put security first. And that's the strength that we bring beyond the capabilities that we have, which are also the strongest, which they also agree with. But it's our will to pinpoint a risk and then deter against that risk. And we're pushing the Europeans to do it all the time. And they expect that for our leadership in this alliance. So the transatlantic bond is much deeper than just having 30 allies, Canada and the US, and then the Europeans. It's what we bring in the will to call a potential ally, a potential adversary, and then to bring everyone together to say, we're going to face this together with our strength and the strength of our transatlantic bond. So we're the essential glue. And I think that that's what will hold us together with the Europeans, because they agree. Now, what we get from that is 29 allies. None of the other adversaries that we're facing have 29 people speaking with one voice, 29 countries, 29 leaders speaking with one voice for what we are saying is our security need. And so we need the Europeans in NATO plus Canada, and they need us. And that's the strength of this bond that I think will not break.
Take it from your remarks, Ambassador Hutchison, that you see this bond and this policy is basically a bipartisan United States policy that will really not change with the incoming Biden administration.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that Joe Biden has said throughout his career, and I certainly have seen him in the Senate for years, he has always been a strong NATO supporter. And I think that will not change. And I think that that is, the bipartisanship is such a strength that we have. We never have to worry. If there is a change in an administration, there's never been a president that I can remember that said we're not going to stick with NATO. Now, President Trump was skeptical about NATO in his first campaign, but he asked a lot. He saw that the Europeans stepped up, and now I think he too is a supporter of NATO.
May I ask you, Brexit, will that have any impact on the NATO alliance?
No, it will not have an impact on the NATO alliance. I think that because the UK is such a strong partner with us in NATO, ally, of course, but they spend the 2%. They have the capabilities. They have never lagged in the 2% in the capability targets. They are, of course, a maritime leader in NATO. And I think I will say this, it's not going to make any difference. In fact, the UK is such a leader in NATO that it is a strength. But where it is going to be felt is at the EU. I think the strength of what UK brought into EU that is now not going to be the same, although they're still going to be partners just as we are, and they will be trading partners, I'm sure, when all of this is said and done. But having UK in the EU made EU more, I think, capable. And I think EU is losing that, but we're not losing UK in NATO. And most certainly they are they're always in the top 5 of the contributors to NATO. And that will always be the case, I know.
Good to hear. Now, questions from another question from the audience is to your point on extending NATO's sphere of cooperation with partners in the Indo-Pacific. Is there scope to formalize this by way of a collective structure of security akin to the SEATO, Southeast Asia Security Organization?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think that right now, informally, there are more associations with our Asia Pacific partners. I recently had a first meeting at NATO with Australia, Japan, India, and myself, what people dub the Asia Quad. And that was to talk about where our experiences are taking us, where we talked about what is happening on the northern border with India and China. Mm-hmm. And I think you saw just recently where our Secretary of State and Defense they went to India and signed a joint security paper where we are going to mutually cooperate together now on security issues. It's not a formal alliance, but most certainly it is the beginning of building up partners in the Asia Pacific. Now, Australia is one of our strongest partners in the Asia Pacific already. They are with us in Afghanistan. They are with us in all of our missions and efforts. They are a great partner that we already have. So is Japan, so is South Korea. So we have Asia Pacific partners, New Zealand as well, I'll say. We have Asia Pacific partners in NATO already. And one of the things that we are doing is bringing them in to more of our ministerial meetings. For instance, in the next foreign ministerial meeting, which is all of our 30 allies, we are inviting some of those partners to join us, the Asia Pacific partners, as well as Sweden and Finland that are our close partners, and EU, which is our close partner. So we are continuing to reach out to these partners that we already have that are in our missions with us. So if they're in a mission with us, that means that we are training together, we are learning to work together, we're learning how we operate together. So that's the buildup of our strength. So when we have Georgia and Ukraine also as partners that are in our missions. Armenia and Azerbaijan are in our missions. So we have a lot of interoperability that happens while we are training together that is part of our strengthening of our partnerships. And most certainly Asia Pacific is right there now, and we'll be building up more in the future.
Interesting. A segue from that question to Latin America. We've gotten questions like, for example, that while Mexico is not a NATO member, at the Baker Institute, where we often speak about the importance of an integrated North America, which I attach a great deal of importance to. But you also, Ambassador Hutchison, alluded to South American nations showing more interest in dialogue with NATO. Could you speak more about the importance of the Americas in the future of international security?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have in NATO is we call it projecting stability. Mm-hmm. Now, mostly our projecting stability efforts have been with Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries that are maybe under the threat of terrorism. And so they reach out to us and they say, we would like to be a partner with NATO and start learning some of the ways that you stabilize democracies and the kinds of military training that you do. So we have Middle Eastern partners that we project stability into their efforts and their governments by doing interoperable exercises together and training, and then putting them in missions when they would like to be in missions. We want to look to South America for projecting stability. They have, of course, democracies all over South America, but maybe we could help stabilizing those democracies by having more awareness of how we can help, for instance, in shoring up their hybrid and cyber, their 5G networks, which several of the countries that we've been meeting with are very concerned about the hybrid social media. And so we are putting them in touch with our hybrid and cyber centers of excellence that we have. NATO has in Estonia, and then there's one in Finland as well that we work with a lot, and trying to do more partnerships in Latin America, because if we have more stable democracies in Latin America, most certainly that is going to strengthen our whole hemisphere and make our Latin American friends and governments that we can do more trade with, more economics with, if they have stable democracies. And as you know, many of the democracies in Latin America change frequently, and they're not as stable as maybe they could be. And we would be very much welcoming if we are invited into doing exercises or doing training or doing sharing of information with those Latin American countries. And, you know, we've talked about the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, China in particular is looking to gain infrastructure in Latin America, in the ports around Latin America. And as you know, the Panama Canal has the two ends of the Panama Canal, the biggest infrastructure port facilities are owned by China. So that's right in our neighborhood, and we need to make sure that we are on careful notice about what is happening in those ports, and making sure that the associations that we have right there in our hemisphere are stronger. So that's been an interest of mine for a long time, as yours and everyone that I'm sure is watching today would say. If we can strengthen our own hemisphere, it also is an economic buildup. if there is security, if there are stable democracies, then there will be more investment that would allow for more trade. And that would be always a welcome opportunity for the strength of our South American friends and trading partners, just as we, of course, would do with Canada, our North American friend.
Excellent. Well, we have time for just one other question, and we've gotten several questions on NATO's role in the Middle East and how you see NATO's broader posture toward the Middle East, including ongoing conflicts such as Syria. And then 3 questions on how do you see Turkey's role within NATO?
Well, Turkey, as everyone knows, has been very active in a lot of areas where sometimes they're in conflict with what we would want Turkey to be doing as a NATO ally. And we've been very out front about the purchase of the S-400, which is a Russian missile defense system. And the US has taken a very strong position and a very open position with Turkey that they cannot have F-35s, which they were very much partners with us in going forward to buy and be interoperable with NATO. But you can't have an F-35 if you've got a Russian missile defense system right in our own alliance. And so we are still hoping that Turkey will not turn that on and make it operable. But so far, they have continued to test it, and that's a great concern. So we want Turkey to be the strong ally that they have been for all the time that they have been in NATO. And they were not in the first group, but they were in an early group in becoming a NATO ally. And they've been a strong partner, and they've been in our missions, and they've contributed. But they are in a very precarious situation right now, having that S-400. So we're hoping that they will come around and realize that we are their security alliance and not having a Russia missile defense system, which is a red line for us. In the Middle East, we have a number of Middle East partners, and I have stayed very much in touch with our Middle East partners because we have two separate dialogues within NATO of different Middle East countries, and they all have asked to be partners with us, and we have a lot of dialogue with them. The ones who have come in to the new stabilization with Israel, with recognition and normalization with Israel, UAE and Bahrain are certainly partners with us. Qatar is a partner, and Kuwait, of course, is a very important NATO partner, and there, we have a NATO Center of Excellence there. Jordan is a very important partner. Tunisia is a partner.
Attention in the mission, attention in the mission. This is the Marine Security Guard on post 3. The time is 1900 and the mission is now closed. Please secure all classified material and turn off all unnecessary electrical equipment and mining areas.
Sorry, that was the Marines that closed the mission at 7 o'clock. So,
I'm familiar with that.
yes, I bet you are. Anyway, so we have a really strong dialogue with our NATO Middle Eastern partners, and it's been very helpful. Israel, of course, is a partner as well, and I meet with the Israeli ambassador, and I think that they are on a very good course right now to have the new normalization with more of the Middle Eastern partners. And that's a good thing. That has been a significant achievement, I will say, in the past few weeks from this administration. So we are looking for all of these dialogues that I think have strengthened NATO, because we have had the dialogue. You look at Syria and Libya, where hopefully Libya is now beginning to have more settling down, and we have been very proactive in encouraging that without being active in the area. And the same, Syria is still very problematic, but we have a number of ways to have influence, even when we don't have partners that are in the area, but mostly we will have partners that are in the area, sometimes on different sides. So we have to try to tread carefully, but continue to bring people together to encourage ceasefires and tamping down tensions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hutchison, for an outstanding presentation and for your outstanding public service over the years, and especially in this critical posting at NATO. We're really honored to have you as part of our Baker Institute Directors Lecture Series, and we're looking forward to the day when we can welcome you back and host you in person.
Well, I can't wait to get back to Texas, and I should be there in January. So I'm really looking forward to coming home. But gosh, this has been a great experience, Ed, just like you know, because you've been an ambassador and you've been in the thick of things for representing the United States. And it has been a great joy for these 3+ years to be able to be a part of this alliance, which I think is so valuable and so important. But also to represent my great country.
Yes.
So
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.